For those joining us on YouTube on live stream, please note that this session will begin in approximately 3 minutes. Stay tuned. We wish we had some lovely background music, but I would certainly invite any of our students, Nusha or Riley or Ashlyn, to hum if they would like their version of the NOSM University theme song.
I think if I started humming or singing, I would actually drive the attendance down and people would start fleeing. You definitely don't want me to do that.
Just doing a quick mic check. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Thanks, Nusha.
Yes, Dr. LeBlanc, fantastic. You also look very funky.
Can you hear me? I just signed in. It's Melissa.
Hi, Melissa. Joe, are you there?
Check, 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 check.
Great. And I don't see Courtney yet. Well, good afternoon, everybody, from beautiful downtown Sudbury, where it's 18 degrees, although gray. And of course, many of you are all over the country. In fact, I know some of you are in Calgary at the Canadian Conference on Medical Education. Some are actually in an airport in Toronto. Some are in Thunder Bay, and many are scattered across the multiple 800,000 square kilometers of what is the Northern Ontario School of Medicine University entire campus, NOSM U. This is the Dean's Lecture Series. The lecture series began in 2020, and it is a student-led event where the students in our undergraduate medical education program choose the topic and they organize, invite the speakers, and bring people together for discussions on items that are important to them. And bienvenue, Ani, bonjour. This is intended to be a multicultural and psychologically safe space for open discussion about anything that is, at the top of your mind on environmental sustainability in medicine and medical education. I want to thank the Student Planning Committee, Rachel Pete, Ashlyn Kapansky, Riley Mose, Jenna Simpson, Nusha Ramsundar, Kayla Kalandises, Avery Newman Simmons, Katie Zulik, and Erica Handel. They've all been amazing contributors to the development of this session, and we hope you enjoy it on this lovely Sunday afternoon. So I will be introducing the next steps, which is, of course, our reflection on the territory acknowledgement and our reflection about today. We not only acknowledge that the entirety of the university's campus is on the homelands and First Nations Métis people, as well as, of course, our specific buildings on the territory of Fort William First Nation in Thunder Bay, and the Anishinaabe Nation, especially at Tikamishing and Wanapate First Nations in Sudbury. But where are you? What legacy are you reflecting upon? I know those of you in Calgary, where I've been attending that conference virtually, and the Society for Rural Physicians conference that we just attended in Ottawa, there is a lot of legacy and history with those territories. And it's not just about thinking about the territory, but what it means to our planet. We have a planet that is currently facing many challenges because of humans. So as we go forward, please reflect on this. Take the next slide. I know that, in fact, my colleague will speak to the individual biographies of each of these individuals who will be presenting. But let me just say, sit back, maybe pour yourself a nice cup of tea or wherever you are, a glass of whatever you'd like to drink. Maybe make some popcorn because this is going to be fun and entertaining, and we hope you will actually be stimulated to think. So, Jenna, did you want to do these introductions now or wait until we get to the next few slides, and at the end of the next slides, do your introduction of the bios?
Yeah, maybe we can do some of our housekeeping and then I'll introduce our speakers.
Over to you.
Fantastic. So hi, everybody. Great to see so many people joining us on the live stream on YouTube and here on the WebEx as well. Really excited to be joining all of you today. So I'm Jenna. I was part of the student planning committee for this event. And so just a bit of an outline of what today will look like. So we'll be beginning with a student presentation and kind of contextualization of environmental accountability and sustainability in medicine and medical education. That will be with Rachel and Ashlyn speaking to that. We'll then have a presentation on planetary health and Indigenous communities with Dr. LeBlanc, Joseph LeBlanc. And then we'll move into a panel discussion, which will be moderated by Dr. Verma, and will feature our panelists, Dr. Vipon, Dr. Lem, and Dr. Howard. And so we're really looking forward to hearing that discussion, at which point we'll head into a question and answer period. So feel free to think of your questions as we go through today, and we'll have an opportunity for some discussion at that point. Just a bit of housekeeping today. So this event is being live streamed on YouTube and is recorded. So just keep this in mind as you consider your questions and comments throughout the event. If you're viewing on WebEx, please feel free to post your questions in the chat function. It'll be moderated and will be asked in that question and answer period. So feel free to put that in at any time. And if you're viewing on YouTube live and want to contribute to that question and answer period as well, feel free to email your questions to communication@nosm.ca, or you can tweet at the NOSM and we'll check those as well. And we'll have a feedback form at the end of the event, and we look forward to your feedback as well. So just briefly, our session learning objectives, just to kind of set the tone as we head into today's event. So our goal for this event is to describe the impacts of the climate crisis on human health and well-being on individual and population-based levels. We're also looking forward to discussing existing medical student and physician-led innovations that are aiming to promote environmental sustainability. And we're also looking to identify potential roles for medical students and physicians in driving environmentally sustainable clinical settings, communities, and beyond. We have many medical students and NOSM faculty on this at this Dean's Lecture Series with us today, and so we're hoping that kind of gets everybody's wheels turning on what some next steps are. So I'd love to maybe if we can go back, Rebecca, and I'll just introduce those panelists before we head into our presentation by Rachel and Ashlyn. Amazing. So these are our four amazing speakers today. We're so excited to welcome you all and really looking forward to hearing from all of you. So Dr. Joseph LeBlanc is a lifelong Northern Ontarian and a member of the Wikwemikong Unceded Territory. He holds an Honours Bachelor of Environmental Studies in Forest Conservation and an Environmental Management Certificate and a PhD in Forest Sciences from Lakehead University. Dr. LeBlanc is recognized as a leading expert in Indigenous food systems and community development in Canada. He has also received several awards, including a Top 20 Under 40 Northwestern Ontario Visionary Award and a 40 Under 40 Northern Ontario Business Award. Dr. LeBlanc was appointed as NOSM's inaugural Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusion on July 1st, 2020 for a 5-year term. And he's also an Assistant Professor of Indigenous Health at NOSM. So we're really welcome, Dr. LeBlanc. Joining us today, we also have Dr. Joe Vipon. So Dr. Vipon has worked as an emergency physician for over 20 years, currently at the Rocky View General Hospital. He has been active on the climate crisis since learning of its repercussions 15 years ago. His first advocacy campaign was as a spokesperson and strategist for the Alberta Coal Phase-Out Movement and the Canadian Coal Phase-Out Network. And with these, has had an impact on approximately 66 NT of greenhouse gas emissions, or 9% of Canada's total GHGs. He is president of the national charity Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and is also the co-founder and co-chair of the local nonprofit, the Calgary Climate Hub. And during COVID, was the co-founder of #Masks for Canada and Protect Our Province, Alberta. Joe grew up in Calgary and continues to live there with his wife and 2 daughters. So welcome, Joe. On the line today and joining us on the panel, we also have Dr. Courtney Howard. Dr. Howard is an emergency physician in Chief Dragi's territory and a globally recognized leader on the impacts of climate change on human and planetary health. She has advanced policy and advocacy on active transport, eco-anxiety, movement building, plant-rich diets, fossil fuel divestment, carbon pricing, coal phase-out, hydraulic fracturing, vaccine equity, and health impact assessments. She led the 2017 to 2019 Lancet Countdown on health and climate change briefings for Canadian policymakers, was the 2018 International Policy Director for the Lancet Countdown, and has researched wildfires and menstrual cups. Dr. Howard sits on the board of the CMA and the Global Climate Health Alliance, the steering committee of the Planetary Health Alliance, the WHO Civil Society Working Group on Climate Change and Health, and editorial advisory boards of the Lancet Planetary Health and the Journal of Climate Change and Health. And she loves dancing with her 2 daughters. And last but certainly not least on our panel today is Dr. Melissa Lem. Dr. Lem is a Vancouver family physician who also works in rural and northern communities within Canada. President-elect of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and founder and director of Prescription, ParkRx, Canada's national nature prescription program powered by the BC Parks Foundation. She is a globally recognized expert on the nature health connection. She is also engaged in advocacy and policy work on a broad range of other issues, from climate change and hydraulic fracturing to sustainable healthcare and low carbon transportation. A senior writer for the CBC, her work has been widely published by media, including the Vancouver Sun, Toronto Star, Montreal Gazette, the Narwhal, and National Observer. She was the resident medical expert on CBC TV's hit show Stephen and Chris for 4 seasons, and is a regular contributor to CBC Radio and CTV News. Dr. Lem was the inaugural winner of University College's Young Alumni of Influence Award at the University of Toronto, a 2020 Dual Innovation Grant recipient from the Canadian Medical Association, a 2021 World Parks Week Ambassador, sits on the advisory committee of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, Health and Wellbeing Specialist Group, and is a clinical assistant professor at University of British Columbia. So thank you to all of our panelists, and we're so looking forward to hearing from all of you today. At this point, I will pass it over to Ashlyn and Rachel, who will start us with the student presentation and contextualization.
Thanks, Jenna. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, albeit virtually. I'm really excited to be able to kind of guide this conversation and talk a little bit about environmental sustainability in medicine and medical education. And I just wanted to first pose a couple questions and just start thinking about, why does our impact matter? And then moreover, why do we need to care about sustainability, and specifically the greater climate crisis we find ourselves in as medical professionals? So our news feeds, they're regularly filled with the evidence of climate change, be that extreme weather, flooding, droughts, wildfire. And as health professionals, we find ourselves in a unique position where we can observe the direct effects that changes to our environmental systems have on our patients' health. For those who haven't heard of this term before, I'd like to introduce you to the concept of planetary health, a field which characterizes the health impacts of human-caused disruption of Earth's natural systems. Next slide, please. So we know that this is a global issue, and it's a global issue that disproportionately affects those who have contributed the least to the climate crisis, primarily countries with low and middle developmental indices. But that's not to say we're not also seeing this direct impact of climate change on those who live in Canada as well. Across Canada, we've seen increases in wildfire with consequential increases in asthma and evacuations. We've seen flood-related deaths and damages, droughts, higher rates of allergies and tick-borne diseases such as Lyme disease, heat-related illness and subsequent death, relocation and stress from coastal erosion, specifically in PEI, displacement, and the impacts on the availability of traditional foods and mental health in the far north. Unless we begin to take collective action in holding ourselves, industry, and governments accountable to change, this is only going to continue to increase. I'll pass it over to Ashlyn now to chat a little bit about her own personal experience and how she's seen this affect her patients.
Thanks, Rachel. So yeah, my name's Ashlyn. I'm also one of the members of the Student Planning Committee, and we're so grateful for everyone who came out today. So I would like to speak about an experience I had this past year during my third year of medical school. For those who don't know, in our third year at NOSM, we spend 8 months learning in a rural community, and I just finished up my third year placement in Kenora. So this past summer, Kenora was devastated by many wildfires, including the Kenora 51 fire, which actually grew to more than 200,000 hectares in size and became the largest wildfire recorded in Ontario. While I was in clinic one day during my placement, I spoke to a patient with severe asthma who had lived in the rural Kenora area for years, and they spoke to me about their experience with the wildfires this past summer. So during this peak wildfire season, the patient's ability to breathe in their own home had been so negatively impacted by the smoke that they actually had to move into the city of Kenora, where the smoke was not as prominent. This individual had lived rurally for years, which one may expect to have better air quality in comparison to the city center, yet they had to leave their rural home to escape the heavy smoke. And if the fires continue to get worse each year, who is to say that the city of Kenora itself will be safe enough for someone with severe asthma to breathe comfortably in? So this is an example of an individual who's displaced from their home in the Kenora region due to the wildfires. However, they were not the only one. Many First Nations communities were partially or fully evacuated due to the smoke from the fires or the threat of the fire itself. This included the communities of Poplar Hill, Deer Lake, Pikangikum, and Cat Lake First Nations. Indigenous peoples are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, and as a socially accountable school for Northern Ontario, it's our responsibility to speak about these issues. When discussing climate change, individuals often discuss about the changes we'll see in the future and how we'll see the impacts then, yet climate change is already occurring all across the globe and right here in Canada. Next slide, please. So the experience I just spoke about is just one example of how many individuals' health is currently being impacted by the changing conditions of the climate, and how, as a medical student, I am already seeing the impacts on patients in clinic and in clinical settings. So for this reason, as future physicians, it's so important for us to learn about this topic and have it incorporated into our medical education. This will allow us to consider how the climate crisis will impact the rates and severity of various diseases, to understand the barriers our patients will face when attempting to live a healthier lifestyle, and also to advocate for systemic change and a global focus on the climate crisis. So climate change has been noted as the greatest global health threat of the 21st century, which I'm sure many of you have heard, yet this also makes it the greatest health opportunity. So I will leave it at that. And the Planning Committee and I are super excited to hear from our 4 panelists today. So I will now pass it over to them.
Are you guiding us through this? I think we were going to start with introducing ourselves. Is that?
Yes, we're going to go in the order that you had decided. So I think we were going to go with Dr. LeBlanc first. Dr. LeBlanc.
Sure. And so just to clarify, as an introduction, or are we going in a row?
you're getting going. Let's
Oh, awesome. Okay,
hear
so
from you and then Dr. Vipon,
excellent.
Dr. Howard, and Dr. Lem in that order.
All right. Well, thank you. I really enjoy this forum every year. I really appreciate the students that are organizing it, and thank you so much for the invitation. I thought a lot about the questions that you asked leading up to it, and what we could be shared here in 20 minutes, and how we can really take away something meaningful. And ultimately, as I was reflecting, I think about um, taking the blinders off to the systems that create the problems that are presented in front of us. And sometimes when we look at these major problems like climate change, food insecurity, water insecurity, housing, we tend to kind of look to tweak the existing system, with those blinders. And ultimately, I want to speak to that today, and talk a little bit about how you know, um, health is an outcome of generative systems, right? We're talking about negative impacts, forest fires, and we're experiencing this because sometimes we take for granted the fact that those generative positive outcomes have been there, right? Without much effort, and as a species, and collectively as ecological communities start to exceed the carrying capacity of our local environment, um, we're starting to realize those negative impacts, and in a lot of ways miss what we've lost, right? And so I wanted to kind of focus there and think a little bit about how climate change, as we know, is a human caused um, issue that is tied to the violation of natural balance. And, this is the real threat, that we say, and it is, climate change is the threat. But looking at how we um, live, in disbalance, and uh, put our faith in things that have led to us taking more than we give, right? Like this exploitative relationship. And we talk a lot at the school lately around decolonization, right? Colonialism is one of those structures that facilitated the exploitation of this place and facilitated the um, exceeding of our carrying capacity. Capitalism, another. So this imbalance, isn't something that we need to tweak. It's something we need to understand and move away from. Um, when we talked earlier, the learners and I, about preparation, we wanted to talk about food systems and water systems in particular. As was said in my bio, I have a particular interest in that, and really am thinking a lot about how those are the outcomes of, again, the erosion of sovereignty. So, the intentionality that we see, can be also understood to sort of change this, and I'll speak a little bit about that. So I'll put in the chat when I'm done talking. There was a recent video shared by MPP Saul Mamakwa, who talked about the health systems working as they were designed, right? And it's important, again, our focus is going to be, let's take the blinders off. So there's some vulnerability that's needed. And as Dr. Verma said, it's a safe space. We can have difficult conversations, and certainly very open to having further conversation with anyone. But as we look at that reality and say, what does it really mean to say we're in Indigenous territory or on Indigenous homelands? And I want you to think about the place that you're in, and maybe some of the places that we have grown to love, that we kind of think of as wild or as of nature, and as removed from humans, because they weren't always that way. And it's those systems that generated health and well-being in community. So, as I said, capitalism, colonialism go together, and then the element around that focus on the erosion of the indigenous nations that were here and the deliberate imposition of dependency. I wrote a chapter in a book called A Land Not Forgotten. It describes what happened to indigenous food systems. And essentially what we talked about is the idea that there needed to be an intentional erosion of food as is foundational to the household, community, economy, and there was an intentionality to have indigenous people at the time, Indians, die off. And I'm not, the first to say this. I'm going to, just touch on that, but definitely hoping that you'll understand what I'm saying. And these policies were really set up to establish a place called Canada, places called Ontario and Sudbury and Thunder Bay and Kenora and all of the places that we know now, the mines that, were set up, the forests, but also the recreational opportunities to support the families who were there. So, we're in a virtual space, and I'd like you to think about, your own time in either a lake. There's a lot of them across Northern Ontario, all named the same thing, Trout Lake or Bass Lake or Long Lake, and they're all over the place. And as you think of those spaces, we're conditioned to not think of them as food systems. We're conditioned to not think of them as, sources of clean water for drinking. And, the communities that were built in the image of neighborhoods, right? So as you fly into a remote community, it's a very unnatural space. And that's what I, again, reflecting on this, wanted to leave with you is, this is not natural. It is not natural to live with food insecurity, water insecurity, insecure houses, unsafe houses. That's an outcome of a deliberate imposition of a model of community that also came with a whole suite of health outcomes. So if you spend time in remote communities, you'll see a lot of ramps on homes, from amputations, people missing teeth, eyes, the preventable things, right? And there are a lot of people, and I'll speak to that in a moment, working within systems that are disruptive, within systems that are meeting the needs of local people. And there's important philosophical shift that we have to get to understand that. So, what facilitated cheap access to the land? Colonialism, right? And what supported all that, is that capitalist perspective. So I want to kind of move now to, those that are living in the system that is resulting in meaningful change. And I've had the great pleasure of working across this region, in Northern Canada, meeting people in communities who, they're worrying about their home. They're worrying about their individual household, their community. They're not necessarily waving a flag saying, come and put this in Toronto Star, or come and put this in a publication. And it's really inspiring, people who are working to make plans, implement them, that are really shifting that intentional change. And it's led me to kind of conceive of this as like a collective effort to change, like a powerful river, right? As you look at, standing beside a challenge like climate change, as you look at standing beside a challenge like the negative health outcomes that are there, the disproportion in access to resources, we might call that income security in a food security lingo. It feels overpowering, and it feels like, it's always been this way. But that's not how natural systems work. That's not how the water flows. The water responds to, its environment. And, as we start to think about these small efforts to big efforts, the learning objectives of today are to look at, how clinicians and students can play some role. And, taking those small steps yourself, throwing rocks in the river, working with your neighbor, working with your colleague, working with your classmate to do something bigger, is throwing bigger and bigger rocks. And I hope that, as we work more and more upstream, we start to really feel that energy shift. And like I said, I've had the great pleasure of working with people across this region that make me feel like that's a real reality. So what are the things that they're working on, and really as we work through this concept of reconciliation, decolonization, reparations, right? Understanding that these are not about tweaks. This is about repairing damage to systems that once generated health. The focus then becomes on a hybridized home economy. And this is an important concept because, through diversity, through hybridization, we build resiliency. And right now, there is a movement to support community-based life projects. I'm seeing shifts in organizations like the Maple Leaf Center for Action on Food Security, who is funding revolutionary changes, not programs, right? A shift from the programmatic mindset to sustainable systemic change. Gagegi Sagaba, the Northern Ontario Indigenous Food Sovereignty Collaborative, is one of the first funders of its kind who is funding micro grants to households, Indigenous households, for food sovereignty initiatives. So I encourage you, I'll put a link to it, but take a look at their Facebook page. This work is happening. People are coming together to focus on really centering Indigenous communities. And, that's a decolonial perspective that we can take forward, is the idea that, it's not, 400 kilometers from Thunder Bay. It's not the middle of nowhere. It's the middle of somewhere. And if we treat everywhere as the middle of its place, then we start to see the assets that are in community and can really focus on like that generative system building again. And, as I think our challenge is, academics and students and clinicians and people who are thought of as leaders in community, you have to really take a look at, what does advocacy mean? And I'm thrilled at my colleagues here today. I'm really happy to have you here with us at NOSM University, because I see that evolution in your work from the activist who asks for change to the actionist that does and leads change. And advocacy can play all kinds of different, can take all kinds of different shapes, but it's important to recognize where to put that energy in an appropriate time, right? And that concept of shifting to centrality, shifting to community-based, asset-based development, but also an equitable perspective. Understand that there are distinctions in various places, right? So, our response to climate change can be at the same time hyper local and collective. And so, and our um, are coming together to, again, intentionally throw rocks, as I was talking about before, can lead to that change. So my time is wrapping up a little bit. I want to leave you with some key notes to think about and to really, I think, find a place to engage if you haven't, and if you have, find a place to work together with us. The equity strategy that we've worked on at NOSM University integrates a significant shift in how we relate. And, this can and should be extended to the local environment. And I'm pleased to have the next speaker speak a little bit more to that. A big thing in medicine right now is the concept of income security advocacy. You know, and when we look at that again, with those blinders to the past on, we tend to think about only things like a living wage and you know, a guaranteed annual income, and those are important tools. Those are definitely important city-based tools. But I also want you to think in a broader sense to say what is coming into the household, like security in what is coming in. And that diversity leads to, like I said, hybridized microsystems. So when we met before, and I said to Nusha, I said we could talk for a long time on these topics. So I have a timer running, which I don't normally do, and I, you know, I want to give respect to the concept of, you know, water security, and think about those places I referred to before. So, you know, if you have a camp or have been to a camp on any one of Northern Ontario's, you know, Long Lake or Trout Lake or Bass Lake or whatever, how do you get clean water? Right? It's not from, you know, a system that has to be built to every place piped in. And, you know, this is the reality that, you know, we can work towards to address water security issues in Indigenous communities, as well as food security issues. And, you know, ultimately you'll ask the question and say, well, why don't they just do that, right? Why don't they just, you know, build the houses out on these beautiful lakes and all this place? The complexity of that funding, I don't have time to get into, but in general, what I've observed in my work with the communities is a very strict control and validation that is required from the Crown, and that still exists today. So we can talk about, you know, reconciliation programs and other things, but that shift, like we've seen with some funders, like we've seen with some donors, needs to come into the Crown as well, as to think that there are plans, there are emergency plans, there are plans to move communities that are flooding out, there are plans to address, you know, housing crises by expanding out into broader areas of reserves. There are plans to address food systems like the Anishinaabe Nation food strategy, other community food strategies, and housing strategies. All of this work occurs, but Crown actors have a difficulty following that leadership and trusting that the investment in those solutions will lead to, you know, more votes maybe, or, you know, some kind of benefit. So ultimately, you know, what I want to take, what you want you to take home from this, and I want you to think about, you know, how we can engage is to take those blinders off, you know, recognize the systems that are creating the situation that's being presented. In this case, you know, planetary health, climate change, food insecurity, water insecurity, housing, you know, um, the idea that, you know, we have a housing crisis in the middle of the boreal forest, where they also happen to source wood to build the houses which we feel secure in, is, you know, an issue we need to think about critically, as is food security and disparities in health. One of the things we're doing to do that, I mentioned the equity strategy, is also the Nourish project. So the Nourish project has 3 focal points, and you'll see this over the next few months. Over the summer, we're going to convene coalitions to work on these, but I'll put a link up later on. Nourish for Health is a national initiative. NOSM University has partnered with Indigenous partners, as well as the Thunder Bay Food Strategy, to move forward on number one, procurement of good food meaning traditional, local, ecological foods, you know, developing some networks and tools around that. The other is on public health environments, and the other on education. So I encourage you to engage with those if you're interested in, you know, joining this movement and really affecting change in our local health system. But also, you know, if not that, I'm throwing rocks with all kinds of people. So let's think about that, you know, and let's think about the way that we can support each other to really start to take some intentional action. Because if there's one thing to take away, is to say that, you know, the outcomes that you're seeing are intentional. They were designed this way. There's a whole wealth of information that you can look at to understand that. But with the blinders off, we can see where we've come from and start to understand where we can go. So thank you so much to the students. I'm looking forward to hearing others, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dr. LeBlanc, and we will reserve our questions for the end, but I know there will be questions to you specifically about, what can, for example, students who are on placement actually do to locally advocate, and think about that. Be a actionist, not just an activist. I love it. The next speaker is Dr. Melissa Lim. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Dr. Verma. So we were asked originally to kind of talk about ourselves, how we got into the planetary health field, and some of the actions that we've done. So I don't love talking all about myself, but that was the assignment that we were given. So that's what I'm going to do. So I would say that my journey into planetary health began over a decade ago when I discovered how important nature was for my own health. And thank you, Dr. LeBlanc, for pointing out how Indigenous stewardship since time immemorial has really preserved those spaces that provide us with clean water, lands, and recreation that sustain us. So I just moved back to Toronto from northern BC, where my first job out of residency was as a rural family doctor, which I loved. But I was feeling stressed out in this new urban environment in Toronto. And this led me to discover a massive body of knowledge about the health benefits of nature. And this is a concept that crosses cultures, but which Western medicine is just starting to rediscover. And that's when I made it my mission to try to create a movement that recognized nature time and access to it as essential for our well-being. So I started writing and speaking about it, making connections, and things just snowballed over time. I connected with the BC Parks Foundation in 2018 and then helped them launch PARX, which is Canada's National Nature Prescription Program, in 2020. And this is now recognized across the world. And something that sustains me in this work is the knowledge that research shows that people who are more connected to nature are more likely to protect it and engage in more pro-environmental behaviors like conserving energy, like recycling, and engaging in broader climate action. Next slide. So around the same time I started working on nature and health, I decided to start taking acting classes just for fun to exercise a different part of my brain. And one day I actually saw an ad in Craigslist that was looking for a fun female MD to be on a talk show. And that ad was actually for CBC TV's former lifestyle show, Stephen and Chris. And so I became, as mentioned, their resident medical expert for 4 seasons. And then because I would help write online articles around my appearances, their digital team invited me to start writing other pieces for the CBC. And that's how I became a senior writer for them. And so while I was being a TV doctor and spreading the word about nature and health, work on climate change and health was just starting to pick up steam among physicians in Canada. And so my colleague, the amazing Dr. Courtney Howard, whom I did residency with, became involved in CAPE. And she said a few times to me, "Hey, Melissa, we need you here in the climate movement." But to be honest, I hesitated because I was perfectly happy working in this safe and fun nature, health, and media box. But it was when I became a mom and read Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything when my son was 3 months old that I couldn't unknow what was coming if we didn't change course. And that was when I changed my mind. And then when I moved to BC about a year later in 2015, I joined up with the BC chapter of CAPE. You can change slides now. And started learning all about our local environmental and climate issues, and then became president-elect of CAPE's national organization a year and a half ago. And I have to be honest, for the longest time, I felt kind of guilty that I hadn't joined the climate movement sooner. What was I doing going on TV, and acting and hugging trees, like how useful is that? But those skills and experiences in storytelling and my work for over a decade building awareness and a team around the role nature has in our well-being have been incredibly useful in my work for planetary health. So I'm just going to take you, through what one of my weeks looked like last month to show you the kind of work that I do. So on Monday, I met with a major CAPE donor to explore her priorities and build relationship because we need funding to do effective work. I also did a media interview on PRX that day and met a PRX Alberta launch coordinator for a walk at the beach. Tuesday morning, I recorded a podcast interview with CNN's Dr. Sanjay Gupta about nature prescriptions. And then right after, I hopped into a monthly meeting with the BC Climate Reboot Group to strategize how to push our government to take bolder climate action. That evening, I spoke at an event with students from across the Metro Vancouver region about careers and sustainability. And then Wednesday to Friday is my real day job. I usually work in my full service family medicine clinic where I'm the medical director of a team of about 15 doctors and 7 MOAs. And even though I'm the primary wage earner in my family, we made an intentional decision to live modestly so that I could keep 2 days per week open for volunteer planetary health work. But that Wednesday, I actually took the day off work to speak in a roundtable on Canada's climate adaptation plan with Ministers Stephen Guilbeault and Jonathan Wilkinson. And being able to meet government and business leaders there has been useful for CAPE in so many different ways since then. I'm also a climate panelist on CBC Radio's Early Edition every 2 weeks. And because I've worked with media for over a decade, I know a lot of reporters and producers who often report on stories I pitch to them. So for example, some of the BC Cape campaigns that have gotten national media attention, I think we'll switch to the next, oh, we're on the next slide now already, include asking the environment or the education minister to ban educational resources from fossil fuel companies from BC schools. And there's been actually a major win in that aspect that we're going to share later this week. We also launched a billboard campaign last summer about the health and climate risks of natural gas that, for example, highlighted the local risks to rural communities, downstream risks to Indigenous communities whose land is being violently trespassed upon to build pipelines. And as you can see from this picture, I also frequently write op-eds and speak at Vancouver City Council meetings during key climate votes. But it's really building these skills and connections over the years that have provided me and the people I work with so many different ways to push for policy change. And I think that's my take-home message here, is that with any field of medicine you choose or skill set you have, you can put it to use for planetary health. People pay attention when doctors speak up because we're trusted. And it's really choose your own adventure, because almost any interest, almost any passion or skill set you have can be focused into this work. So to summarize, my key advice would be to figure out your unique value proposition and skills, connect with like-minded people, like your provincial CAPE chapter, learn more and get to work, because we can make a huge difference together. Thanks.
That's exactly what I think we need to hear. That is just such inspiring and call to action words, Dr. Lam. And your advocacy has been widespread, and you really, you should consider coming here in Northern Ontario, because we have lots of fun stuff for you, and Dr. Toner and his team will find you a great spot in emergency medicine. So we'll be welcome to see you, at least come and visit, because NOSM.
I have actually. When I moved back to Toronto, I worked in Sioux Lookout and some of the surrounding communities. So yeah, I've worked there. I know Northern Ontario for sure.
Wonderful. Well, we'd love to show you around NOSM U as we continue to grow. Dr. Joe Vipon, I think you're actually in Ottawa, are you? And I don't think you're in Calgary anymore.
I don't think I'm supposed to be here though, and that's because I tested positive for COVID yesterday. So I get a 10-day enforced stay at a hotel while I work on testing negative again, so I can get on a plane. And thanks to Courtney for being my Uber Eats delivery person yesterday and bringing me dinner. It's very interesting to be living in COVID land. I'm trying to put my my screen on, but it says I don't have permissions. Is there anybody out there who can give me permission?
I think Rebecca was going to show your slides. Do you want her to put them
I
up?
was hoping to do, anyway, we can do the other slides. I was just inspired by Dr. LeBlanc's talk, because he did kind of go beyond himself. And I thought, well, what if I put in some stuff that's maybe a little bit less Joe and more learnings?
So actually, Rebecca, you could give him permission if you'd like, or Kim, you could give him permission.
Looks like I have permission now. Let me try that. See if it's working. No, that's
not yet.
Says no. All right, I don't want to use up too much people's time, so why don't we just go with the slides that were originally there, and I'll just have to be less full of wisdom, as I just won't be able to keep up with Dr. LeBlanc, which is fine. So I'll just go through these really quickly. So I, like Dr. Lem, got inspired to get involved because of a book. The book that I read was called The Weathermakers, and I read it a long time ago, 2007. And then I spent 5 years just fussing. Like I just didn't have any outlet for this anxiety that was related to knowing what the future holds if we didn't act. And so I was fortunate enough to be invited to be a part of this report on coal-fired power's health on Albertans in 2012, and I jumped at the chance. Even though I wasn't an air pollution specialist, I wasn't a coal specialist, I basically took it upon myself to learn a new discipline in air pollution, electricity, and climate. Next slide, please. So we won. We won in 3 years later, 2015, and this was amazing to be a part of that. And it really took a lot of my anxiety away, because once you actually start actively changing the dial, it really makes a difference to any kind of anxiety or a distress that you have, because you're actually, one of the things about anxiety is you're reacting to a situation where you don't have control over. So if you can take control over that, it makes a big difference. So next slide, please. I got involved in the national coal-fired phase out, and I actually took the lead on that. And so we gathered 23 different organizations from across the country, predominantly in Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, which were the last 3 provinces to have coal-fired power. And we organized, and we wrote op-eds, and we met people, and we did everything we could. And a year later, we actually had a win. So that was another. So now with that, because coal's so dirty, and from a climate perspective, those 2 campaigns have had an impact on 9% of Canada's emissions, which is okay. It's okay stuff. Next slide, please. And I could not have done this unless I was a physician. So this is an example of a situation where I was asked to be at a presentation, and they told me to dress up. They said, you be in your uniform, because we want to project the fact that climate is health. And so in the same way that a police officer, if they were at a event that was related to police enforcement, would wear their uniform and gun, even though they're not expecting to use their gun, I wear my stethoscope and scrub top, and it helps to identify me. Next slide, please. And then we got involved with an Office of Sustainability at Alberta Health Services. We went from not having any kind of Office of Sustainability to having a fully funded office. That was really exciting. And regional committees across Canada right now in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick are working independently on getting a similar Office of Sustainability in their health services. Next slide, please. And more recently was involved at a local utility pushing for net zero. Next slide, please. And I took some of these learnings and I put it forward to COVID advocacy as well. When you see injustice, when you see poor science, it forces you to, when you have this kind of viewpoint that, yes, I can be an active citizen, yes, I can change the world, it allowed me to feel obligated to step up when they weren't advocating for masks and say, okay, we need to have masks for all Canadians. Next slide, please. I think we're into Courtney's slides now, if I'm not mistaken. I thought I had a couple other slides on there, but maybe it's stuff that I was going to add. If I could just, you can get rid of the slides, and maybe I'll just talk a little bit about the other things I wanted to share. And I'm just going to go to my slides just to refer so that I have my visual cues. So I just want to mention that advocacy is part of CanMeds. You know, it's up there with scholar and professional communicator, but it's not really taught. There's no point in the curriculum where you're like, okay, this is how you be a health advocate, yet it's considered to be a key part of being a medical expert. When you're seeing a patient, you're seeing them at the individual level. But when you're getting involved in public health and advocacy, you're actually dealing with entire populations. And I can guarantee you that I've had more of an impact on Canadians' health overall as an advocate than I've ever been as a bedside clinician. I value both. There's nothing more satisfying than taking a person from, you know, pain and suffering through to wellness. But there's also something amazing about changing policy. So the actual word advocacy the definition is the act of or pleading for, supporting, or recommending, or active espousal. That's the dictionary definition, and I don't even really know what it means. So I'm going to tell you what I think advocacy is. Advocacy is the act of changing the future. The world is on a path, and you're helping to nudge it in a different direction than what it was going before. And there are things you can do as an individual. There's lots of things you can do as an individual, but I just want to say that one of the things I've learned from all the campaigns that I've been involved in is that the key thing is being organized and acting as a group. Because as powerful as one individual can be, 5, 10, 25 individuals are even more powerful. And so that's just a plug for the organization I belong to, which is the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. If that's not your thing, get involved in something else. Get involved in something local. Get involved in something Indigenous. But get involved in some kind of organization, because then you can use the strengths of other people. You can work towards objectives together, and you can pool even money. And there's, as great as $500 that you can personally donate to a cause is great. But if you get, 100 doctors contributing $500, suddenly you have a real program. And my final thing I'm just going to say is that one of the things that CAPE is offering now is something called the Advocacy and Mobilization Program. It was just launched last week. It's a full year-long program. Well, actually goes from June till February of next year. And it actually will train learners and staff physicians as to how to be a successful advocate. We have funding for this. It's a very minimal cost. I think it's $300 for staff people, free for learners. And it starts on June 18th. There's a small application that you have to fill out. And if you really want to learn how to change the world, that's a great first step. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Courtney.
Thanks, Joe. And you're also welcome anytime to come and visit when you feel better. And of course, really, your incredible advocacy. Dr. Howard, it's so great to see you. Welcome, and thank you for rescuing Joe for his dinner last night.
Joe has rescued me many times from various things. It's we were celebrating yesterday the handover. As emergency doctors, handover is really important to us. And what I love about CAPE is that the collegiality and professionalism and solidarity lets us be good at handover too. And so we're able to slip in and out of presentations and, different challenges the organization has faced as a trio of presidents really over the course of the pandemic. And I've really so appreciated that. And so, it was interesting. I was at the Society of Rural Physicians of Canada conference over the weekend, and I was looking at the CanMed slide in an advocacy presentation and thinking, in fact, advocacy itself demands excellence in every petal of the flower in the CanMed's criteria. You can't do this unless you're a scholar. Joe was talking about how he had to learn so much about climate change and coal-fired power plants. You can't do this unless you're a communicator. Melissa Lem is a professional communicator, and it's one of the things that makes her so good at this. And so, although what we're talking about, it can be seen to be sitting within that one petal, really everything you've learned within medicine and everything that you are will contribute to you being an effective advocate. So I went to school, like, many of you did, to learn how to work in a hospital. And at the time, I really thought that's where health sort of mostly sat and where it was mostly generated. And since then, I've come to realize that what we do in the hospital is entirely dependent on the stability of our surrounding structures. And so knowing that we're at a transition point where a lot of medical students, according to what we know from curriculum surveys, according to all the presentations I give to other docs, we're at a point where we're transitioning from a very sort of egocentric model of the world, very Western science, white man at the top in Dominion, colonial model, to one that's more ecocentric, where we recognize that we're all in interrelationship with one another. All of the learners on this call are going to find themselves in clinics where they're interacting with preceptors who are in transition in their own frame. So I'm going to just quickly go through how I have found it most useful to quickly explain planetary health to conventionally trained physicians who weren't taught this themselves. Because when you look at the education on planetary health literature, it's acknowledged that it's a place where all of the generations of health practitioners are learning together. And so there's more intergenerational sort of tutorship each way than maybe we have had in the past, which is an interesting sort of challenge to hierarchy in and of itself. So I'll get you to go to the next slide. So when I describe this, and the thing about systems change, wait a second, that you often get to set the agenda. And so I'm taking a course with Marshall Gans right now, and he talks about the third face of power. And the third face of power is the agenda setting phase. So who gets to decide what you're going to talk about? Who decides what's in the plenary at the conference? Who decides what's on the agenda at the staff meeting? And we have often, as planetary health practitioners, not been that face of power. And so you're trying to squeak it in around the sides. So you need to get pretty good at being able to communicate the frame in about 2 minutes flat. So the way I do this now, and I've done this around the CMA board table, my fellow board members may now be tired of me doing this because I've done it at every single board meeting for about 2 years. But through that, I managed to get climate change and health onto the strategic plan without us ever having had a single presentation on it. And I have to tell you, I consider that to be quite an achievement. So thank you. And so the way I find health practitioners understand this the best, because we're quite focused on our clinical work, is I describe the ecological determinants of health as the necessary structural underpinning of society. So the foundation of a planetary health nest, if you will. Next slide. And so if that's really stable, the soil, water, climate, et cetera, we get to build the very complex structures of financial systems, the social systems that give rise to the social and structural determinants of health that we talk about more often, things like education, income, housing, et cetera. And when that's going really well, we have the resources and the stability to staff and supply and make sure that the buildings are intact of our high income country healthcare systems. Next slide, which are extremely complex. And next slide. So when you do a literature review across different countries looking to see what proportion of overall health status is attributable to healthcare, it's usually between 5 and 25%. And I've found that when I present this to audiences, and you can do it with these slides if you want, this is in a publication in the Lancet Planetary Health, or you can just do it with your hands. I will often just do it with my hands. And then you put the hospital at the top. All of a sudden, people realize that not only are there all of these determinants of health that are factoring into what brings people into the hospital or prevents them from going into the hospital, but that what we do in that hospital is entirely dependent on the stability of our planetary health nest. And I think that this, all of a sudden, clinicians who otherwise say things like, well, what does climate change have to do with me, are like, oh, you mean I don't get to have the pharmaceutical that I need to do my work? The supply chains aren't working because of a forest fire has cut off the highway. They're like, oh, they all of a sudden start to understand how it's all connected. So I would just, as you guys are all sort of fanning out, just practice in front of a mirror talking about your planetary health nest and figure out how you're going to communicate it and why you care about it quickly so that you can help, because the reality of it is that you're going to need to onboard a lot of your preceptors. And so this has been, I've tried a lot of ways over the years. I've been at this for about 13 years now, and this is by far the way that has helped the best. Next slide. So when I first came to this, it was in Nunavik, Northwest Territories, north of 60. So I was a new doctor. I wanted to work with Doctors Without Borders. And I had picked up a book on climate change in the airport on my way up. Just picked it right off the shelf in Edmonton. And I read it on my way up. And I was super alarmed by the time I got to Nunavik. I hadn't learned anything about climate change in, my 12 or 13 years of post-secondary education. But I had been taught in my emergency training how to recognize badness. And I could see quickly that this was badness. And so I happened to do a literature review on the glacial internet that we had at the time in Nunavik. and pulled up the Lancet's first commission on climate change and health that said that climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century, just a couple of months after it came out. So there I was in Inuvik reading this, and I looked up and I started asking around, and instead of looking up and talking to people who, you know, minimized it and said, oh, climate change is not a thing, people were like, oh yeah, well, my cousin Bob went through the ice on the way to his trap line. It's making it very difficult for us to access our traditional foods. We're worried about drowning, increased potential for trauma as the ice roads get less stable and they form later and they melt earlier. And, you know, it's all making us feel quite sad. The elders say that there weren't any landslides related to the permafrost when they were little, and now they're everywhere. And the change in the landscape and our relationship to the land is really disquieting. And so I basically happened to learn about climate change in one of the ground zeros of climate change, just the way it worked out. And I was extremely lucky because I happened already to be booked to go down to the Family Medicine Forum immediately after that. And so I essentially flew straight from there down to Calgary. And as happens to a lot of people once they sort of have their climate awakening moment, the moment where it really lands with you, I was telling everybody, like I was spraying anxiety. I was like, if you walked up to me and said, hey, Courtney, want a coffee? I'd be like, did you know that climate change is the biggest health threat of the 21st century? Which is a point at which I made a lot of people, I scared a lot of people. And, there were a lot of cocktail conversations that ended with, I'm just going to go over here and go to the bathroom. So what I learned from that is that how you approach the conversation is really as important as the conversation itself. And so when you're having those moments of anxiety, what I have found is that it's pretty important to take time for yourself to go into nature, as Melissa's Park RX recommends, to exercise, to make sure you're getting enough sleep, to spend time with your friends and family, so that you can help center yourself, take that time, be generous with yourself, so that then when you go into arenas where you may be trying to get other people on board or influence them, you can do that in as centered a manner as you would any clinical interaction. So I try to be as centered in any of this work as I am before I walk into a room and talk to a patient. When I'm there with a patient, it doesn't matter what happened in the previous room. Like frequently in the emergency department, we run a code and may lose somebody and then have to walk into the next room and sit down and be centered to somebody's concerns around their upper respiratory tract infection. And that's just the job. And you need to get good at that because the person in front of you is the most important person. And when I translate that skill set and that approach into my work in planetary health and treat my audience as that patient, whether it's one person, whether it's a group, I find that I think it's the most compassionate approach. I'm the most open, I'm the most present, and the most effective. So just if you're in one of those really sort of emotional moments, to just really invite you to be kind to yourself. So anyhow, I wasn't in one of those when I showed up in that exhibition hall in Calgary. And luckily, to a friend, Dr. Konya Troughton, who'd been my mentor doing a menstrual cup project, I was like, Konya, did you know that climate change is the biggest health threat of the 21st century? And she took one look at me and walked me over, literally, physically, to the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment table where Dr. Warren Bell, who was one of the co-founders, was sitting. And Warren, as a long-term family doctor, also took one look at me. I was like, whoa, this woman is activated and ready to do something. I could even in the moment see his family doctor eyes, like doing a mental status exam on me. And he said, well, do you want to sign up? And I said, well, I want to do more than that. And so I showed up to their next board meeting and someone stepped off, Alan Abelson, and I was the only other person there. So I stepped on, and that's how I really got on the board before I knew anything. So that was 13 years ago. Our executive director at the time was Gideon Foreman. And at the time, the organization was really focused on pesticides. And that was sort of how we made our name, was in obtaining many cosmetic pesticide bans provincially. And so I was like, we need to solve climate change. And Gideon was like, what's your target? I'm like, I don't know. What do you mean? We need to solve climate change. And he said, Courtney, we need a target. And as it happened, the first great target, and really Gideon came up with it in association with environmental groups, was the coal phase-out campaign that Joe had described. And you can see that when you break a big problem down into small, digestible, achievable chunks, You start to make iterative progress, and each one of those wins generates hope and a case study that inspires people and allows you to build your team. And so, having realized that, at one point I was asked to present at the Planetary Health Alliance conference, and I drew this picture. And I asked several people who had been really successful change makers, Mary Wynne Ashford, who is one of the international presidents of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, who'd been a mentor of mine in medical school. I said, does this resonate with you? And she said, yes. And I asked Nick Watts, who was he's now the head of decarbonizing the NHS. And he said, yes, that makes sense. And so what a lot of us, and now that I've read the behavioral change and the movement building literature, this is very consistent with it. It's about choosing one thing, finding the team and the resources required to achieve that, picking really strategically the most ambitious, feasible target that you think that you can accomplish. And that target, depending on your team and your resources, can be at the micro level, so the individual level, the meso level, so the hospital or community level, or the macro level, national, subnational, provincial level. Whatever it is you think that is the most ambitious thing you could possibly achieve. So you want something that makes people's eyes twinkle. So if you pitch your target to your group and they look bored, that's not the right target. You probably need to be more ambitious. I used to ask people to please present on climate change at their school, and everybody would look bored. And I didn't have a lot of uptake. And then I asked people to help me get the Canadian Medical Association to divest from fossil fuels. And all of a sudden, my mailing list went from about 2 people to 100 people over the course of about a month. And we had a whole, for me, that was really one of the beginnings. That was in about 2014. Of a national approach to climate change and interest in it amongst the physicians in Canada. And what I learned from that is that aim higher than you probably think, because people want to be envisioning and working on something that they feel could make a meaningful change in the world so that their work feels worthwhile. You definitely need a huge team, and you need the convening capabilities. So you need to, someone actually has to do the secretarial work of setting up meetings, convening meetings, setting out the agenda. If nobody does that, nothing happens. And it's okay if it takes you more than one time to get it right. We started working at the CMA on different things in 2012. Nothing happened in 2012, or it felt like nothing happened. But what we were actually doing was creating relationships with the people in the organization and showing them that we actually knew what we were talking about, making them get a little bit used to the ideas, so that when we kept coming back and we kept coming back and we kept coming back, by the time we came back in 2015 and had the opportunity to vote on a really well-constructed motion around divestment that we'd been chatting about for years now, with the highest levels of leadership at MD Financial, by then they were like, oh, it's that girl from the Yellowknife again. Cool, we'll just pass it. And it was relatively uncontroversial. And so sometimes those wins can be not winning the campaign, but it can be making a critical relationship or having a critical learning that allows you to change your pitch in such a way that it better speaks to the people that you're working with. And what you'll see is that once you start to make those concrete steps happen, it generates hope. And so now when I give presentations, I used to spend about 90% of it talking about a problem and 10% talking about solutions. Now I try hard to be about 30% problem, 10% acknowledging the mental health challenges of this work, and 60% just talking about cool things that we did. And all of a sudden people will say that my presentations, they'll leave smiling. And that matters, because that energy, that pull is what's going to get them off the couch and make them want to come and help create change with us. So as you're embarking and going into the world from this presentation, I'd love it if you were starting in your head to have percolating thoughts. Okay, well, what's the target? What could I start working on? And who could I be working on it with? And who do I know who could make a really cheap, really beautiful poster? And what's a moment coming up politically or in the school year where I can maybe get some attention around that? It's a real marriage of quantitative, strategic thinking and creative thinking. And I think that's why I love it so much. So we're delighted that you have us here today. If you want to learn more, I would highly recommend signing up for the advocacy and mentorship course that CAPE is putting on, and really looking forward to the further discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Howard, and thank you to all four of you for such amazing talks. And I think being, of course, Dr. LeBlanc, who's internal and knows our ways, and of course, the three of you coming from your particular clinical lens, you're efficient, you're effective, you're articulate, and you say it like it is. We do have a lot of people on YouTube, and Kimberly is going to track if they have any questions. But basically, what I'd like to do is I actually want to pick up on what you said, Courtney, about picking one thing and moving on it. And I think this question first goes to you, Joe, and Melissa, and you can each take a crack at it. We're an institution, we've got a team. We're probably where you were at in 2012 with the CMA, in that we're thinking about it. We're in that stage of change, the pre-contemplative, maybe at the contemplative stage. And we want to make a difference when it comes to our curriculum and our institutional leadership. The usual curriculum is like, oh, well, change the respirology teaching program or the dermatology piece. How can we, and I'm saying this because I know our Vice Dean Academic and our undergrad dean are here. So hoping we can talk a little bit about really effectively leading curriculum change in the medical school to address planetary health. Courtney, do you want to go and then Joe and then Melissa?
Sure. So I can first give you the inside scoop that there's a committee at the Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada that is working on this right now. And so the energy on this is climbing spectacularly. And you probably saw that as of March, the MCCQE competencies require climate change and health. So the stick is coming. So what I'm sort of here to say that at the highest levels in Canada and internationally, this is being seen as a core competency, because really, I drove across BC last year, and it was smoke from one side to the other, knowing that my colleagues mostly couldn't tell you what an air quality health index was. I was livid. I was livid by the time I got to Alberta, because I had actually spoken with multiple colleagues on my way there. I had noticed that some towns didn't even have the air quality health index posted for weeks. And so for a physician to be in a town for 2 weeks where the air quality health index was probably 8 to 10, I was there and I've done wildfire research. I'm pretty good at estimating it visually. And not be advocating that it at least be posted told me that they weren't attending to it. They were not counseling their patient population on what to do in a wildfire emergency because they didn't even have the information and they didn't know what they didn't know. That is unacceptable. Wildfire smoke is increasingly appreciated to increase overall mortality. There's action items associated with vulnerable populations. We need to be working with municipalities. Fort McMurray Hospital was evacuated in a matter of hours. I actually worked in North Bay. That was the first place I ever worked as an attending physician. I've worked in Sudbury. My husband was part of the NOSM Ottawa pediatrics program. So I spent a lot of time in Northern Ontario. There are a lot of forested communities up there. Wildfires we know that this is going to increase until at least mid-century, best case scenario. We are not at a new normal. It is going to get worse. We need to prepare. And so this is a core, this is far past a optional. This is core clinical competence, core. And so it should be like, if your students haven't had a presentation about the air quality health index, they should have one before June. Like every single med student should have that. Or I really honestly don't think we're doing our basic job. So in any case, that's sort of the sort of basics of it. But really, I just wrote a paper where I'm pitching. I actually think teaching students active change-making skills is one of the best ways to draw people in, because then you're quickly making change. Everybody gets depressed at the end of a presentation where they hear about a bunch of problems. But if instead you have some sort of flex competency program, and maybe you already have that. I was watching some UBC students present on theirs yesterday, where students get the opportunity to actually actively make change over the course of a semester in a supported advocacy environment. That's actually the way that you're going to learn the most, the fastest. And it feels a bit scary. There's sort of, degrees of freedom and potential for failure. But we know from our clinical medicine that if we're not operating at that sort of place where we're supported, It's a little bit scary, but we're putting in our first central line with help in, a place where we've learned it as well as we can beforehand. That's where we need to be working on a planetary health spectrum as well. So I would really focus first on core clinical competencies: heat, wildfire smoke, flooding, cold weather, drowning, and then consider a really active learning, change making, longitudinal program as part of your curricula.
That's really helpful. Joe, I'm going to tweak it a little bit for you and say that one of the things that we see, especially because of the pandemic, is actually a lot of plastic wastage. What do you think we can do to address some of that when we're in the world where we have glove after glove, swab after swab, gown after gown?
Can I take 3 seconds to just follow up on Courtney's thing? Because I do think I want to add a twist to this, and then I'll look at plastic waste. I just want to say how much leadership is important, Dr. Verma. Most of the time when I see big change coming, it's because a leader cares about this. And the reality of climate is that it affects all aspects of any organization. And so you just have to have, there's two ways of looking at it, either through a lens, or I guess a lens is the best thing. Just put that lens of climate in front of every single decision, whether it's supply decisions, hiring decisions, travel decisions. By starting the lens on every decision, and that should be at every institution, not just a medical school, but a civil government or a company. That's how you make the change that we need to see. So that's to answer the last part. I think we in the medical field are in a big set of trouble when it comes to plastic waste for two reasons. There's this idea that it's cheaper to use disposable items rather than reusable items. I think that is only true if you don't count the externality of the CO2 that's created through the use of these items and the waste that's produced, because generally waste management's relatively cheap to as opposed to capital purchases. So we need to start to integrate those externalities into our cost decisions. And maybe it's not just about cost. Maybe there are other factors like saving the planet that need to be factored in as well. I think one thing we should consider doing is, and if I can put on my COVID hat for 2 seconds, we know COVID is airborne. We know that surgical masks aren't enough. We need to be wearing respirator masks. And there's every reason to say, why doesn't everybody use an elastomeric reusable mask? Those ones that you see in the movies that the miners use that are, have the two big canisters on the side. They're $25. So they're like the equivalent to 14 disposable respirator masks, and you can use them for years. And I don't know why we haven't shifted to that. I can't use them in my institution. I'm not allowed to. But why? Why aren't we allowed to? It's insane.
I saw you tweet one on your way to Ottawa. Where do you buy those?
So I use right now a disposable. I use the ones that I use at work because I just take them home and reuse them. I use a 3M respirator mask, but there's lots of Canadian-made respirator masks. Vitacor are particularly good. I like those. But the elastomerics, you can buy them at home hardware. They're like $25-$35. They're not expensive.
Melissa, there's actually a question in the chat that I'd like to put to you, if you don't mind, which is from Jenna. Do you want to pose your question, Jenna?
Sure. Thank you all so much for your presentations today. They've been amazing, and I'm thinking about so many things, but my question is, where do you think is a good place for medical students to start to make a difference in our environmental impact?
I think there's so many answers to that, Jenna. I'm going to address that question, but I want to add my 2 cents to what Courtney and Joe have said. So I can't emphasize enough how important healthcare professionals are in this work. Something I put in the chat earlier is that consistently there are these polls that happen internationally about who are the most trusted professions. Nurses, doctors, consistently in the top 5. So when we talk, people listen. There was this international study that was put out a year ago looking at how to frame climate change policy. Should we frame it in terms of economics? Should we frame it in terms of health or migration issues or the environment? And when they applied the frame of health to actually policy suggestions that had to do with climate change, that was the most effective at moving people. And in fact, for people who didn't care about climate change, for people who thought it didn't even exist, for example, the health frame was actually what moved them the most. So that's why it's so important, for learners, for staff to get involved. And something else I've learned about with my work in media, the media love young people. Like they love interviewing medical students, teenagers, kids, because you're both kind of photogenic and you have a lot of moral authority, but it's just people love looking at young people, So I think that's another reason why, with that kind of authority of health and also that young face, just try to, do what you can to get out there. So in terms of ways to start, there are so many different ways, that's such a huge question. But what Courtney referred to earlier in terms of the MCCQE, including climate change as one of its core competencies, that was an initiative that was started by medical students. Like one of those medical students now, actually George Kitching, is on the board of CAPE, and they made it their priority to try to push the MCC to enshrine climate change in their objectives. And that's a big win. That's like a top-down win. And it's going to have these echoing ramifications for curricula. So, but I think, it starts by building your team. So look at, maybe join your local provincial chapter or territorial chapter of CAPE. Look at what kind of groups are happening in your own school. Like, for example, the Dalhousie Med Green team, they played a major part in helping launch park prescriptions across the Maritimes. It was two key medical students, Jackie Mincer and Emma McDermott, who really made that happen. So just join your local team, see what they're working on, see what you're interested in, start learning and start taking action. It's really, but I think, no one should start on their own. I think you really need a team. You need that support as you move forward.
Well, and I'll definitely support our students as they go forward. But there's some realities for all of us. I just completed a fairly substantial, in the window before Omicron, actually, tour of Northern Ontario of 64 meetings and a lot of town halls. And every community that our students go to, Joseph, there's a pulp and paper mill. You can smell the impact of the processing. There's a mine where you can see the impact of the occupational impact as well as the planetary impact. There are First Nations communities where there are challenges with reuse, recycle, how are you, it's a stupid question, like what do the students do? But is there anything that would help our students? Is there a toolkit that we should be providing to our students wherever they're going? Because they're in a different world. It might be different actually in downtown Toronto, Melissa, where, like I lived there for 15 years and it's a completely different urban wasteland too. But for us going to multiple communities, Joseph, what are your thoughts on, what is the toolkit we could equip our learners with and our faculty, frankly, who are out there trying to figure out how to deal with the kind of, as Courtney said, take it one bit at a time.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot. Having spent some time in a lot of these communities, there's that unique, like I said in my talk, they are the center of their place, and that history is very important. So I do think it's a shared responsibility, certainly with the learners and with the university to be prepared and know where you're going. And for some of the learners that have worked with our staff for 106, for example, you have an in-depth conversation with your LCC. You talk about not only the stats, and that's some of where we were in the past. We had our community profiles, and the community profiles included statistics about the community. And what's been asked now is to understand, well, who's there on rotation, who's the resident who's currently there, who are the faculty members, and try to build that community around it. So it's something that we're working on, and certainly, like I said, we're happy to have conversations that around those place-based knowledges. As we do curriculum renewal, I think it's something that we can look at, right? Like we've talked about before, like meeting the accreditation standards is the baseline, right? Meeting the social accountability expectations is somewhere higher than that. And we have to do our local conversation and understand what that is. But, it would be really nice if we could understand that, you're seeing somebody who's, perhaps in a long-term care home somewhere like Elliott Lake or, near the English River, and you understand, what it means to have exposure to mercury, in the English River, what it means to have exposure to radiation while you're mining, or, there's some research on the lung impacts here locally. So, ultimately, I encourage our students to think about that, think about, like I said before, what is the system behind it? And you and I were on the road, and like I said, logging trucks everywhere, the smell everywhere, but that those are all really the um, the impacts of external interests in those places. So, I often think about, what would it be like if those with the vested interest in the long-term ecological impacts were making the decision on these big piles of wood that, are being pulled out, and, the water quality, and, these long-term pieces. De Beers right now, I was seeing some friends talking about the contamination of the De Beers mine, which is done. De Beers is leaving. Now they have a 20 or 25-year reclamation process. Who knows? We'll see what happens. But ultimately, the wealth left, the minerals left, the people stayed. So, what does the future look like where we center those people? Thanks
Isn't
for the
that the
question.
story of Attawapiskat as well, right? The gold was mined, the gold miners left, and the people were left behind. There is a question from Rachel in the chat. Rachel, do you want to ask it?
Sure. I'm actually in the airport heading back from the CFMS SGM, so if there's a little bit of noise, I apologize. But my question's for Dr. Lem. I'm a huge fan of Parks RX and the impact it can have on our patients. I'm wondering how we can apply the same principles to support student wellness and engage more students in planetary health work, given that medical school is often so busy, we don't necessarily have the time to often get out in nature as much as we would like to ourselves. And just with your reference to getting more people engaged in that work, getting more people outside, it's all connected. So just wondering your thoughts on that.
I think this harkens back to something that Courtney was saying about how we ourselves have to be as healthy as we can be. Like, we have to take time to ourselves if we want to be able to make effective change, right? And I think we call nature one of the 4 pillars of health. So whenever I counsel patients about lifestyle measures to improve their health, I talk about diet, I talk about exercise, I talk about sleep, which unfortunately I don't get enough of. That's something I'm really trying to work on, and nature time. And so I think if we can conceive of connecting to the more than human world as essential for our health, then people will make it a priority. So I think that's important. Whenever we do a launch with Park Prescription, something we always offer to anyone signing up to prescribe, so that would be any licensed healthcare professional, from nurses to doctors to physiotherapists, for example. We offer them free nature therapy sessions where basically a licensed, or what are they called? Anyway, I think licensed or trained nature therapy guide virtually, actually on Zoom on their phone, has each participant in their own kind of green space and takes them through like a nature therapy session. And so it's a way for us to show that not only are we trying to add an extra thing to your plate, an extra 30 seconds counseling your patients or whatever, writing the nature prescription, but we also want to make sure that it's part of your own well-being practice as well. So I think kind of centering both the practitioners, but also the communities that they're prescribing nature to in the work that we do is really important, and hopefully can inspire people when they feel it themselves, when they feel that connection, to want to continue to make it part of their lives and their practice.
Thank you.
I like this comment, making the ecologically correct decision. Katie Zujic asking whether there are any insights from the speakers on addressing sustainable practice and resource management in remote and rural communities. And I think this goes to your comments about waste, Joe. Katie, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure, I'll just type in quickly. First and foremost, again, thank you all for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been fantastic listening to you all. So a challenge that I've sort of addressed with some of my preceptors when working rurally has been trying to figure out, again, how we're supposed to manage waste sustainably in these communities that are often hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers away from the nearest sort of processing center, and then sort of balancing that in turn with the fact that trying to process reusable items sterilely also comes with sort of outsourcing it to a larger center. I'm not sure if anyone has any insight into sort of strategies to address this, ways that we can make meaningful change and be making, again, yeah, this sort of ecologically, like the choice that's going to have like sort of the least impact overall with like our carbon footprints moving forward for these communities.
I want to just jump in on that question because I think this is something that we haven't talked about yet. And this is one of the key principles of practicing planetary health is actually prevention, right? So the way to prevent us from using all that plastic, using all those medications, whatever inhalers, is actually a really strong primary care system, right? Which is something that we're having a primary care crisis here in BC right now. We're seeing it across the country. People don't have family doctors. They don't have people who can prevent them from getting to the hospital in the first place, right? So that's a really, really important part of the whole planetary health practice is making sure that people are shepherded through. You know, there's evidence that when people have a family physician, they actually end up in the ER less and they use fewer healthcare resources. So that's a really important part. I think that we haven't really talked about is the whole prevention piece. Anyway, yeah, that's something I wanted to add as a family doctor, as someone who works in primary care. I don't use masses of plastic lines and all kinds of equipment because I'm in my office mainly with my stethoscope and my patient in front of me. But I just want to bring that up.
Joe's face is flashing yellow, or your screen is flashing yellow. Might be a caution sign. I don't know.
I'm not sure what's going on there. Hopefully my internet will be able to transmit my voice. Is it working?
Yep.
Okay, good. I'm going to just take a twist on this. And, you know, I work in a major urban center, but I have some thoughts on very rural, remote communities. The first is I think telehealth has done wonders in improving things. You know, I worked up in Iqaluit in 2003, and we either had to fly in a specialist to see like dermatological cases or fly patients out. And now it's all done through telehealth. And I think that's one thing that we should really maximize the use of. The second thing, and this is, again, not really directly answering the question, when you do lots of media, you learn how to answer the question you want to answer, not the question that people are asking. But anyways, electricity is a perfectly set up for renewable energy in these rural and remote places. And you think that's crazy because they're far north and they're in the middle of nowhere and you got to ship up all these solar panels or a wind turbine. But the reality is that if you're not doing renewable energy, you're doing diesel. And flying in diesel or shipping in diesel costs a lot of money. And that means the electricity prices in these rural and remote areas are much, much higher than those in, say, Calgary or Ottawa. And so therefore, the return on your investment is much faster on your items. And even though being in the far north means you don't have a lot of energy production in December, it means you have a ton of energy production in June, July, August, September. And so therefore, again, that also helps to change the equation. So push for renewable energy in your communities.
Well, I think, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Has Joseph?
I was just
Joseph's still
going to
here?
chime in. Yeah, I'm still here. Just,
Yeah, go ahead, Joseph.
my
Get
hand
going.
is blending in with the trees, I think, in that picture.
Oh, this has been my problem all weekend. My apologies, Joseph.
No worries at all. I just want to chime in on the question, you know, and I want to build off of that concept of, you know, the local production, because it does intersect with that idea of microsystems, you know, and I think there's a lot of value to that. You know, look at what sustained since time immemorial is, you know, looking out after your own needs, right? And there is a focus, like I said, on building those skills now, but I've seen youth organizing recycling programs, for example, and building social enterprises with those, right? Because some of this is valuable product, right? Metal, cell phones, these kinds of things. So, finding ways to work outside of those that are seeking the highest profit, right? Food is a really good example. A lot of that food is very packaged, right? That you would see at the Northern Store or at, small vendors. And some of that is to affect some of the price, but it creates a lot of styrofoam. We've had uh, initiatives like the Fort Albany Farmers Market, which is basically a mother-led initiative to bring good food in that orders bulk, right? Orders in bulk boxes, and they bought boxes from the Good Food Box and at Food Share in Toronto, this kind of like local system where you say, okay, there's different ways to get these resources met. And sometimes when you focus on community, and I don't like that term, middle of nowhere, that, it's the middle of their place, right? And focusing on that in health, focusing on education, focusing on that on food, water, energy, it really does change that idea of then having to run a line from a nuclear plant, right? And lose all of that waste and all of those things that are so much when we look, like I said, with the blinders on, it seems like we should be tweaking, but we can go back to those microsystems. And I think there's a lot in there.
Courtney, did you want to have, I guess, what's gradually coming to the last word? You're on mute though.
I've worked quite a lot with Andrea McNeil, who, as you know, researches planetary healthcare, and also with some of the other researchers in the field. And it's important to know that a life cycle analysis comparing the reusable component of something compared to the non-reusable and sterilized or non-reusable thrown out component, it hasn't been done for every component of medical practice that we work with. LMAs, they've done it on, but for the most part, when they have done it, it shows that sterilizing something, even at high temperature, even in various circumstances, is way lower carbon footprint. And so if a preceptor tries to say to you, like, that's going to be a higher carbon footprint to reuse something, they probably have zero data to back that up. And where a lot of that narrative is coming from is from the people who have been selling us the reusable devices. And so what I've learned as I've done advocacy is there's data, and then there's policy, and then there's creating change in the real world. We're pretty good at producing data, decent at making policy, crappy from an institutional perspective at creating the systems that produce change in the real world. Those systems are called lobbying. Those systems are called PR, right? When you look at the amount of time and energy we put into evidence-based lobbying and PR, I mean, who does that? Who does that? CAPE does that. Organizations like us do it. We have a $500,000 to $1 million budget yearly. Okay, so we are desperately being outplayed by industry who have billions of dollars put into this sort of influencing sector. And so just to have in your mind when someone brings up those worries, they probably don't have a lot of data, and they have probably been influenced by these huge corporations. And so increasingly groups like Cascades, which is part of the Sustainable Healthcare Initiative, are giving us some of the information we need to counter these arguments. But certainly focusing on cleaning up the energy in your community is always going to be helpful. And I just want to bring in the idea of broadband, fast broadband, as a social determinant of health, which is really required in northern communities to be able to institute the virtual care that Joe was talking about. I know here I spend half my time hotspotted to my cell phone because even in Yellowknife, our internet is often very slow. And in the very northerly communities, it's essentially impossible to do a video virtual call. And so, during a campaign that I ran, we came to understand that really is a determinant of health. So that's another advocacy target that you could use to really improve health in a variety of factors: access to income generating potential, access to virtual healthcare for some of your communities.
Well, I think, this is a really positive note on which I'd like to conclude and thank everybody for being not only so inspiring, but informative and educational. and also giving us some very concrete ideas. For NOSM University, you know, we're a fledgling. We're just starting. Actually, we're just 24 days old. So we, you know, although NOSM, the school, has been around for close to 20 years, but we want to be able to lead in this space. And you've given us some great ideas. I think, for one thing, having a student-led initiative that our students could be part of, we really support that. So Rachel, over to you to be able to maybe harness, you know, a green team to lead that. Secondly, I think in our curriculum, and I think Dr. Toner may have left. I'm not sure if he's still here, but certainly we know, and Dr. Chervin's here, that in our curriculum, we have opportunities to really make a difference. And I think with regards to our own individual and institutional advocacy, and with Dr. LeBlanc, your leadership, we have a lot to add in this space. Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much, Miigwech. We will ask people for their feedback. And of course, one of our initiatives is to continue to advocate for this. And instead of course, you know, spending tons of money on all kinds of things, we're actually encouraging people to buy a NOSM small tree planting kit and to plant a tree in Northern Ontario. And we hope that you will encourage, everyone here will encourage everyone else to do that as well. Thank you so much to everybody. And of course, yeah, really great ideas. Jenna, would you like to make some final thank yous or comments? And then we're done.
Yeah, absolutely. Just so appreciate everybody's time today, everybody who tuned in, the amazing presentations, Dr. Verma for moderating and putting on this Dean's Lecture Series. I think so many, especially the students, have taken so much away and are really looking forward to this spurring on a lot of action at NOSM, and we're really looking forward to it. So thank you so much for helping us kind of bring this conversation to the forefront.
Well, signing off on YouTube and at NOSM University. Thank you everybody for coming, and have a great what's left of your Sunday. Bye-bye. Thank you, Joe. I hope you feel better.